It's Gabrielle from Speech Kids and Raising Orchid Kids, where we teach little kids to talk and help parents understand their little kids. And I'm back with Argavan. Argavan, yay!
Hi.
Thanks for being back.
Good to be back.
Remind the good people who you are and what you do, please.
I'm Argavan Nilforoush. I'm a pediatric dietitian. I have both a private practice and then I have a podcast as well. The private practice under Baby Steps Nutrition. You can find me pretty much on all social media platforms, and the podcast also under Baby Steps Nutrition Podcast, again on all major listening platforms. I am a pediatric dietitian, so I focus mainly on nutrition for families, but I like to incorporate all different aspects because we know it's not just what you eat, it's nutrition plus psychology.
Ooh, I love it. Okay. So we're going to talk today a little bit about how are the principles, I'm going to just throw it out and then we'll do what we do, which is chat. Mm-hmm. How are the principles of dietetics and nutrition applied differently for children versus adults? So
yes.
How are you wielding your tools differently for pediatrics rather than an adult population?
Yes, and I love that you asked this question because children are not little adults. Children are very different. They have very different needs. And when you work with a qualified pediatric professional, you know that you're working with someone who is well-versed in child development. So you really want to understand what happens in, say, an infant's brain, a toddler's brain, and a teenager brain. And those really impact what happens on a daily basis. It impacts everything from nutrition and sleep and habits and, even your, what's going on with your genetics, like nature versus nurture, right? All of those things, your hormones. I mean, we can list so many different factors here, okay, but stop. It really matters.
I'm going to stop. You said you're a nutritionist, which means you're dealing with food and gut. And you said brains are doing different things at different developmental stages. Let's spell this out as if people don't know yet. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna spoil it. Spoiler alert. Yeah. Brains and guts are very, very connected.
Yes. There's actually something called the mind-body connection. So now they're saying, and there's so much research that backs this up, that your gut is like your second brain. And they are talking to each other all the time. And so they're not separate from one another. So we talk about the hormones, right? And we need to feed our gut in order to build healthy, nice working hormones. And so there's the mood stuff and so that's huge, right? We know with children. So mood, what is it telling us? It's not just about that moment in time. There probably is something going on in the inside. We need to dig deeper. So everything is talking to one another. So we really want to understand brain health, but we really want to understand gut health, all at the cellular level, because they're so intricately connected.
This is what I love about, I'm on this big nutrition diet kick right now, because so much of what is in the ether and in the profession is based on behavior.
Yes.
Right? We're constantly talking to parents, and I do this in my Raising Orchid Kids class too. We talk a lot about behavior. Mm-hmm. And what I'm more and more starting to do is we gotta pull back this fishing pole, for whatever reason this is the fishing pole metaphor. We've got to reel this in because we are sometimes, always, often, talking about things that are happening at a cellular level that are then resulting in the behavior that we're seeing on the outside.
Yes. And as you and I know as a specialist, you will get a call or an email or a text related to the behavior, right? My child, and I'll use myself as an example, as a picky eater. My child is eating too much. My child probably has an allergy. So we're really just so focused on the behavior. Mm-hmm. But so when you work with a qualified professional, that person hopefully is taking a holistic approach. Mm-hmm. So they're digging deeper. Okay, well, the behavior is showing us this, but what is going on the inside that's creating that behavior, right? And so sometimes kids who are introverted, quiet, they may not show those big behaviors, but it doesn't mean that there's not something going on. So this is where, again, that holistic approach, right? We need to look at everything so we can get a good picture of that child.
And so back to sort of the original question, which is like, so how are you, so you've got there's blood work involved, there's like levels of things that we want to look at. How are you interpreting what the data that you're gathering, and applying sort of a treatment protocol, for lack of a better word, that's differently, you're doing this differently for children than you might for adults? Like what are some of the ways that you tweak that?
Yeah. And sometimes you may not have all the data that you would like. Yeah. So there's sort of this general approach. So if I get a call for a child, I can kind of gauge, okay, this may be the approach that I take. But for the more complicated cases, for example, if something's been going on for a while, right? I look at the birth history, I look at the first year of life, I look at illnesses, medical history, medications. Like if I'm going to really dig deep, then I may suspect there are other things going on. So for example, maybe an undiagnosed allergy, for example, right? Most likely deficiencies. We know in certain groups of children, there are likely to be those deficiencies, and we need to look at like food groups. Well, what are they eating? And also, are they absorbing enough of those nutrients? And so is that the reason why they're having, like rashes or behavioral issues or lack of sleep or, not regular bowel movements, for example. So that's when you do want to get all of that information before you start a very specified, I'll call it diet, but it's not just a diet, it's just a management care plan.
And so when you start you do your preliminary stuff, you have I always think of it as creating a working theory about yes. the organism, right?
Yes.
Like, what's the story? What's the cohesive narrative here that explains kind of what's happening? And you start sort of doing treatment or implementing a plan. Can you give us an example or like a sample? I don't know. Sketch it out for us.
Okay, so if, say, for example, a family were to come to me and they would say, this is the issue with my child. So I would want to get a record of what does the child eat. So ideally, as a nutrition professional, you want a detailed, not just, I think they had this last week and they had this yesterday. But please write down, record, right? The more information we have, the more we can be helpful of what exactly did the child eat. So I'm looking for nutritional gaps. I'm looking for possible food sensitivity, right? Which is different than a food allergy, for example. I'm looking at what medications are they taking. So is there a nutrient medication interaction that may be causing stuff to be going on the inside, right? There are certain medications that affect appetite, for example. So is the child on any of those things? Like what did that first year look like? How were they born, right? So we now know how you come into this world, and that first year of life, what exposure that you got does affect your gut health. And so that could be a long-term impact. So we need to look at that as well. And so when I'm able to get all that information from a family, we sort of have this starting point. And what I explain to families, it's a journey, right? As much as we would like to have a magic wand and fix everything right away, it's like we do need to be patient, and we do need to understand that it's a process. And when you work with someone, we might have to make changes along the way, right? Things that work, we continue. Things that don't work, we need to be flexible and we need to be open. And if we have the knowledge, then we can make those changes as we go.
Yep. This is very similar to the things that I do, right? I start with the detailed history, and then we sort of treat what we see and wait to see if what we're doing is working. And if it's working, we do more of that. Yes. And if it's not working or we don't see any change, we add something, take something away, we make a change.
Yeah. And this is why having to outsource, for example, is really important. So there might be something that's going on that's not within your realm of practice, right? Yeah. So for example, like I would refer out to a feeding specialist if I see it's not just a nutrition issue, but there are fundamental reasons why this child is avoiding certain foods, right? And they could have to do with trauma, like earlier on, or, avoiding certain foods and so whatnot. But this is where you work with other qualified healthcare professionals to really make sure you have great care for a child.
Yeah. So a thing I heard from a family last week was, are they going to make us do an elimination diet for our 4-year-old who only eats pasta? So
Yeah.
I'm asking you, Argavan, what would you do in that situation? Like,
Yeah, so
what,
this is
what's
where
the
we get
framework?
called the food police, right? And I never ever want anyone to feel fearful or they're going to be judged. That's the first thing I tell families is, and they'll say, "Oh, I'm sorry for this," and I said, "This is a completely no judgment zone, and this is why we're here because we're both here for your child."
Yeah.
And so never. I don't take that approach ever because I'm all about respectful parenting. And I feel like if that is what your child eats, and for you to completely take that away can have a lot of negative consequences. So if they're not going to eat anything at all, you're going to see nutritional deficiencies, and that's a health problem. And then also I look at long-term relationship with food. So are they going to have restrictive eating, avoidance eating, binging later on in life? And we don't want any of those outcomes.
Yep.
So we start slow, right? So baby steps, again, why I call my practice baby steps is we want to go slow. We want to be very empathetic to the family and the child and make small changes that hopefully will last for a long term.
Yeah. Feeding therapy is slow. And it's funny because I often have to sort of remind kids, I do some feeding therapy. It's not my specialty, but I do it. And I often have to remind parents, like, this is deeply personal, right? This is things that you are ingesting. Like,
Yes.
we have to tread lightly here. And yet, from a parenting perspective, like, the one thing you're supposed to do as a parent that you know you're supposed to do, yeah, we change the diapers, yeah, we do the bedtime, we're supposed to know how to feed our kids.
Yes.
And so it sets up this really, you must see this all the time. I wonder if you have a story or an example of it where there's so much anguish on both sides of the equation.
Yes.
Because of the competing kind of nature of the beast.
Yes. A lot of now the stress and anxiety for parents are what they hear outside. So the media, right? The media, the Instagram blogs, the parenting blogs, well-meaning neighbors, parents, right? And it's Dr. Google. So I'm going to Google this condition and what is it going to tell me? Elimination diet, all foods are bad. We need to get this out of our system. And then the other side of things is the parents' own relationship with food and how they were brought up. So that's a huge factor. And this is the beauty of why I love to work with children, because I'm also working with the whole family. And sometimes the parents, or a lot of the times the parents will say, well, let's focus on the child. And I'm like, well, let's focus on everybody who lives in the household, right? So we start kind of there and then we work our way down to the child. And sometimes that's impactful in its own way when we figure out the parents' own relationship with nutrition and their own health and how they were brought up and their own anxiety around certain things related to food. And if we can sort of start with the compassion there and changing the mindset there, well, that trickles down onto the child. And those are a lot of children that I work with, if we're not talking about the medically stable, unstable ones.
It's so interesting, as you're talking, I am picturing when families come to you, also when they come to me, it's like we are so, as parents, we are so anxious about our children. We're like, we just need to help them.
Yes.
And we forget, number one, we forget that the only person we can actually do anything about is ourselves.
Yes.
And we also forget our role in shaping the choices, the behaviors, the lives of our children. And so it's this weird tension.
Yes.
Where what I hear you saying is like, sometimes we go way upstream to parents and, what I hear you not doing is, okay, child has to eat these 6 foods and everybody else can do whatever they want.
Yes.
So how does that look on a practical level? Like, sketch out dinner time. So my child is a picky eater. Can you give me don't give me like specific from a case, but like give me a sample, like, how do we do dinner time here?
Yeah. So I always go back to Ellen Satter's division of responsibility. She's been the feeding guru, but we cannot emphasize where it started with her and how powerful those strategies are. And so when we tell families those things, they almost go, oh, wow. Right. So we're empowering them, but we're empowering the child as well. So what does that look like? And this goes from young children to teenagers. So our job as caregivers, parents, is to provide the food. You're offering it to your child, and then it's your child's responsibility to decide how much and what to eat, right? So there's no coercion, there's no bribery. We really don't want to do any of those things because, again, what does the long-term impact look like? And so if we can just sit back, right, as hard as that might be, take a deep breath and just let our child develop, first of all, that intuitive eating, right? That's huge. So am I hungry? Am I full? What is my body telling me, right? All of those things around a meal time, that's pretty impactful. Yep. So again, that's something I really emphasize, like your role as caregiver, right? And it could change, right? When the children are younger, obviously we have more of a role. We're still the role model, right? As the child gets older, but less and less so as they're independent and they're spending more time outside of the home.
Now, there are going to be kids who either don't know how to read their own internal signals, aren't physically capable of sitting at the table, have, sort of a system that is so far out of whack that, I hear them in my head all the time. Yeah, that's fine for families who can do that, but my kid is so wound up that, like, if I put food on the table and don't provide the iPad or don't feed it to them or don't force them to stay there with a promise of dessert, they're not going to eat, Argavan. So, and that's like, that stress is real.
Yes.
They're worried about their child's health. How do you navigate that piece of it?
So that's another thing that's a work in progress, right? So if families think you're going to come in there and you're going to take everything away that's been working, the stress level will skyrocket. And I understand that immediately, right? So the first thing I always say is, again, going back to baby steps. So yes, if that's how your child has been eating up until now, we're not just going to come in there and take that, but we're going to do slow changes, right? And that looks different for everybody. Like, is there a caregiver available to, for example, to sit with the child, right? What do the evenings look like? We might have to make some changes there. So not everything feels so rushed and stressed, for example, right? What we're offering to our child, can we get our children a little more involved in the kitchen, right? So I'm great with playing with food, right? I want my kids to, and I mean my kids, but all kids to play with food and find them interesting and, maybe use special cutters and tools and play and see what that looks like, right? So there's small changes that we can start with to hopefully get away from just distracting them, but having them be more present and intentional with their eating.
Let's sketch this out. Why do we need children to play with food? Aren't they just supposed to eat it?
Yes, because when you get to be creative, right, that stimulates different parts of the brain. And so we know play is so valuable for brain development. I mean, kids naturally are inclined to play. And when we take that away and we impose on them like certain adult things that their brains are not able to handle, then they just shut off, right? So we're not able to have that meaningful connection with them. But when they're playing, it's like, oh, this is the texture and this is the color, right? Actually, kids who are able to play with food and be more involved around food and have a positive relationship with food, they're more likely to try new foods. And this is what we want to, right? So we don't want to force and we want to be patient, but there are definitely studies, and I've seen that also in my own practice, when we can start with those things, then you start to see the magic happen. Yeah. And it does happen because, again, we're going back to autonomy and empowering the child too.
Yeah. It's so, it's fascinating that there's another piece of this, which is very normal for all of our brains to want to do, which is we want to judge everything.
Yes.
We want to judge, am I a good parent or not? Am I a good child or not? Do I like this or not? And this is where it gets problematic when we're training new eaters. and I'm going to ask you in a second about like, what's the research on like how many exposures do we need? But some of what I have often observed is we want to classify things, and this is a normal human thing. We want to know, like, is this good or bad? Should I want more of this or not? And yet, when we're training new eaters, we would be much better served by describing and noticing and experimenting than we would judging. So I am way less interested when I'm doing feeding therapy in whether somebody likes something than whether they know, is it wet or dry? Is it bumpy or smooth? Is it both? The other day, oh my gosh, with this my little feeding client, we figured out the cantaloupe, smooth on the inside. And then they said, but it's bumpy on the outside. And I was like, oh, I didn't even think of that. That's amazing. Because when we stay in that experimentation and that curiosity, our nervous system is regulated because we're not so busy trying to figure out if we need to like flee, right? Or freeze. And then we stay in that exploration, and we've eliminated the need for putting food in our mouth and like from some kind of task-oriented behavior.
Yeah. I mean, we're becoming like children. We're being present, right? They're not thinking about the past or the future. They're just in the moment. But sometimes as adults, we're like, on to the next thing, on to the next thing, on to the next thing, quick fixes, right? And I get it. We're all so overwhelmed. There's a lot going on. And we just live in a society where we need quick fixes. And this is a time, and I always say, like, childhood, it may feel like forever, but it's not forever. So we have to, in that moment, do things differently. As much as, we want it to be like a work issue and we just overcome it and we move on. Children need time, and they'll show us that they need time, and they'll show us that they need our patience and our understanding, even if it's not the way we were raised, right?
Yes. Okay. How many times to like incorporate a food into your repertoire that's like, oh yeah, I totally eat this?
Yeah. So the number is around 20, but I can tell you that doesn't apply to everyone. Like, I'll have families say, well, I've done it 25 times and they still don't. Yes, because it depends on your child and how are you exposing, right? So for example, like some children that are highly sensitive, right? Let's talk about orchid kids, for example. They get overwhelmed very easily.
By smell, which is 90, 80, whatever % of taste.
Yeah.
So, and this is like, pause, parent. If you have a highly sensitive child who's a picky eater, chances are their sense of smell is like off the charts. They're a super taster.
Yes. And just sight, right? So you see something, your brain shuts off. They're like, this is too much. This is something to be feared. And so everything else in the, like the cortisol level spikes in the nervous system. And so you're not going to get your child to say, oh, wow, this is exciting. Thank you for making this dinner for me. I'm going to enjoy this. No, you're going to get, right? Either they shut down, push back. Yeah. And then it's a power struggle. Yeah. So for example, like 3 little cherry tomatoes to us may look like a tiny little portion, but for a young child, it looks like a giant bowl of tomatoes, and it's off-putting. Right? So you might have to do half of one, and that's your exposure, right? So everything's small amounts. And so this is where, again, we want to put ourselves in the position of the child, right? We don't want to look at it as an adult. We want to look at it as, what is my child thinking or smelling when they see this, right? So those are the changes, like the small changes that we can make, but they go such a long way, right? Portion sizes is what I wanted to get at.
Yeah. And it's so interesting. That's something else we talk a lot about too. It's like, dime sized is what we're talking about in terms of a portion for new foods. And, some kids, they might need 100 exposures before they're going to incorporate it. My brother's a prime example. It's funny you mentioned the tomatoes. He was a child who hated tomatoes, never wanted to eat a tomato. Parents made him eat a tomato every so often when we had it, tiny little sliver. He is a 50-year-old man who loves to eat tomatoes. But he was an adult before that happened. And so, again, your child is gonna, I mean, kids tell us what it is that they're ready for and what is and isn't a just right challenge. And so, you know, if parents are getting a lot of resistance around food, then we know it's too much.
Yeah, or they might be what we call super tasters, right? So again, so highly sensitive children are highly sensitive in every single aspect of life, right? So they probably don't like certain fabrics. They hate certain textures on food, right? So they're, you know, sound stimulus, smell stimulus, everything is heightened,
Yep.
right? So when it goes to super tasters, they have extra taste buds on their, it's just heightened. Everything is empowering for them, right? Yeah. So again, it comes from that understanding of this is actually what's happening with my child. They're not trying to hurt my feelings. They're not trying to be bad kids. It's nothing that I did wrong. This is just how my child is. And so I'm going to work with this situation, you know, again,
and get some help with it.
And get some help with it. Exactly.
Yeah. Ooh, we could go all day, as you know.
We could go all day, and I would love to go all day.
We're going to leave it there. We'll have you back.
I would love
so
to.
Much.
Thank
so
you, Gabrielle. Thank you for having me.